Hi, I'm Erin McKean, and I'm here to talk to you today about documentation in open source. In fact, I'm here to talk to you today specifically about how documentation makes a difference in open source. And so I already introduced myself as Erin McKean, but I work on docs advocacy in Google's open source programs office. So my job, and it's a fun one, is to help open source projects have better documentation. Now, you might not have heard the term docs advocacy before, which means you're probably not hanging out with me enough. But docs advocacy is really the developer focused practice of encouraging better software documentation, whether that's by making docs yourself or helping other people make docs, or just by creating a culture that enables good docs to be produced. And today I really want to focus on that last clause. Each and every one of you can help create a culture that enables good documentation in your open source work. I'd also like to help you love docs. I mean, you may not love reading them, or you may not love writing them, but you will love, I promise, what docs make possible. Now, I admit personally, I do love docs. I love reading them, I love writing them, I love talking about them, but it turns out that I'm not the only one who loves docs. You know who else loves docs, especially in open source? Developers. Developers make decisions based on docs. In fact, our hosts, Tidelift, they said they found in their 2019 survey that 72% of the developers they surveyed said that established policies and documentation is a key decision factor when choosing open source. And 93% of developers surveyed by GitHub in 2017 said that incomplete or outdated documentation is a pervasive problem in open source. Devs think that lack of docs in open source is a big problem. And lack of documentation was the top reason developers gave for deciding against using an open source project in the DigitalOcean 2018 survey. And lack of docs will make devs walk away from your project, no matter how technically excellent it is. So when I tell people that I work on making open source docs better, they often say, great, we need better docs. And then I ask, what are you doing to help your projects have better docs? In open source, docs have to be everyone's responsibility. If having great docs, or having any docs really, was easy, all projects would have great docs. But they don't. So that means there's some work ahead. That's the bad news. The good news is that first, it's not as much work as you might imagine. And second, that there are tools and resources available to you to help, with more being created all the time. The first work that I want to ask you to do is some mental work. No paper, pen, keyboard, fancy tablet necessary. I want you to think of documentation as one of the tools in your open source toolbox. I believe that most of you use open source, create open source, or sustain open source as part of your overall business strategy. Open source helps support your business goals. Now, it's totally okay if one of your business goals is be a cool place that developers want to work because they also get to work on open source projects. That is a perfectly reasonable business goal. Hiring is hard. But documentation should support your strategic goals in open source. Just as you focus your open source efforts, you should focus your documentation inside your open source efforts. Now, we talk about docs as this big, monolithic thing, at least, but there are 4 different types of documentation, at least, and they solve different problems. This concept comes from Daniele Pochita, who outlined these 4 types of documentation in his 2017 PyCon Australia talk. And you should choose which of these types of documentation, which of these documentation tools to use based on the goal you have and the job you need your docs to do. So a fairly typical business goal for open source is using open source to bring customers to your product, whether that's through connecting to a larger ecosystem or also by running hosted services, etc. Most open source projects want users. Now, I'm going to assume here that your code actually runs, does the thing it's supposed to do, etc., so that the problem is really that users can't see the utility of your project. And the tool to solve that problem is a how-to guide first, preferably something quick that solves a real problem that actual human beings have. Now, what's the difference between a how-to and a tutorial? Well, there's a joke that the difference is a how-to solves the problems your users have, and a tutorial solves the problem you want them to have. But everything else being equal, if your open source project is not meeting your user targets, this is where you should start. Don't assume people will spend the time to figure out how to make what you've built work for them. Show them. But jokes aside, I do think of a tutorial as how to learn the preferred way to do something. Once a user has bought into the idea that your code is useful, has played around with it a little, has patched whatever leaky boat of their own project with your how-to, a tutorial helps them develop the mental model to contextualize everything your product is capable of. A tutorial has more surface area than a how-to. It allows for more extension or more scale. If a how-to is a recipe, then a tutorial is one of those cooking classes where you create a full meal. A tutorial solves the what now problem. Tutorials can also solve a branding problem. If your tool is mostly being used for use case A, but you really feel like the most growth is in use case B, then write tutorials showing off use case B. Think of tutorials as like an upsell doc. Another problem that can be solved better by tutorials than by how-tos or other kinds of docs is the let's make friends problem. If you want your product or code to be used alongside other, maybe bigger players in the ecosystem, tutorials can demystify those integrations. In my opinion, tutorials should be a key part of your open source product strategy. You should know where your users are, and tutorials should help you reach them where they are. Tutorials and how-tos are pretty straightforward tools to solve pretty straightforward problems, but there are definitely other problems you can solve with docs. So what if your goal with your open source project is to popularize a new paradigm, concept, or standard? A very common problem is when people aren't using your project because of a barrier to understanding. They either don't understand the tech or, more likely, they don't understand why the tech matters. People can't find a solution to a problem they don't understand. You need explanation documentation. This is a very common outlet for developer marketing. If you've ever traded your email for a white paper that promises to explain everything you must know about something, then you know exactly what explanation documentation looks like. A couple of companies that do explanation documentation really well are Honeycomb and LaunchDarkly. They do that. They do great explanation documentation because they're trying to get people to think about new paradigms, for example, observability and feature flagging. One of the best creators of explanation documentation is Julia Evans. She's Bork, B0RK on Twitter. She writes wizard zines explaining technical concepts. If you don't know her work, you're in for a treat. Highly, highly recommended. This is one of the best ways to really create deep value with docs. Good explanation docs don't age as quickly as tutorials or how-tos, especially for core topics. And they really create goodwill when well done. In fact, if your product or project is geared towards junior developers or those working in smaller orgs where they have to wear many hats, I'd recommend creating explanation docs for as many concepts that touch your product or project as possible, especially around deployment, security, or accessibility. What do those developers worry about? What do they worry about not understanding well? Explain it to them in the context of your project. Okay, so now we're on to my favorite kind of documentation, reference. Reference documentation is basically snack-size explanations. Reference documentation solves the Inigo Montoya problem. Reference documentation, though, is not just glossaries. Reference docs can include API docs, including OpenAPI specs, sample config files, places to look up error codes, stuff like that. Reference should be the linkiest part of your documentation. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Be lazy. Link to other people's docs and explanations. Link to Wikipedia. Link to blog posts or articles. Heck, embed tweets if they help your user understand. Reference docs should be a helping hand over rough ground and give your user the confidence to move forward and use your tool, product, project, or code. Now, reference documentation can also include links to prerequisites or further reading. If your thing depends heavily on another tool or library, including reference documentation with links to or shows how to configure that documentation, shows how to configure that dependency is very helpful. Do not have your reference docs be where warnings go to die. If something is going to implode, explode, spontaneously combust, or turn into a giant pile of wriggling spiders if something is misconfigured, that information belongs at the point of use. Basically, tutorials and how-tos and explanation docs get people to try your project. Reference docs keep devs in your project and get devs to recommend your project. Reference docs are where your customer satisfaction comes from. If you have an API or a config-driven project and you see lots of abandonment, check your reference docs. Are they up to date? Do they even exist? Are they comprehensive? Are they easy to search? Also, contributor onboarding documentation can be considered a kind of reference documentation. If one of your goals is to increase the number of external contributors to your projects, it's not efficient if that project is not self-serve when it comes to onboarding. And it's also a diversity and inclusion issue in that contributors who don't already know who to ask for help getting started won't be able to start contributing. Okay, so I hope at this point you're thinking, wow, I know exactly what kind of docs solve the problem I have with our project. I know exactly how to reach our business goals with documentation. But you still have to create the docs. So you're here and you really want to get started, but you've already taken the most important step. You want to start. You're starting to build a culture of documentation. Everything else is paperwork. Now, lots of people want to jump right into making docs, but I think you have to start asking a couple of questions first to really build a culture of documentation. When you're talking about your open source strategy and how you'll create, support, and sustain your open source projects, these are the questions that will help you create focused, useful documentation to support your strategic goals. What docs do we need? How will we create these docs? How will we maintain these docs? Nothing's worse than out-of-date documentation. How will we know that these docs are doing what we want them to do? How are they helping us reach our goal? So for example, maybe you just open source Glue libraries to help connect your closed sourced or hosted product to a larger ecosystem. Then you might only need a couple of quick how-tos, and your maintenance strategy is to get an alert when there are SemVar changes in the larger ecosystem, or if your tests fail. If there's already a survey that you're doing with your customers, see if that, after you improve your docs, add these how-tos, see if there's a jump in the number of customers in that ecosystem after you publish your how-to. Okay, I think you're ready to make docs now. I'll share some tools and templates and also some resources for finding people and help with the process. So first of all, there's the Doxy project, which is a Google open source project. It's a theme for the Hugo Static Site Generator, and it's specifically organized to help people create technical documentation sites quickly. Doxy is a site template. It has sensible defaults for you to fill in with your own content. Now, the great value of templates is that they reduce cognitive load by making it easier to do a reasonable thing instead of shaving so many setup yaks that you're too exhausted to actually do the thing that you wanted to do in the first place. So if you need to have a whole new site for your documentation, I highly recommend that you check out Doxy. It's pretty active. We have a good number of external contributors, and we plug in with all sorts of third parties to really make it's straightforward to make a doc site so that you can actually concentrate on your content and not your setup. If you're looking for templates for individual documentation types, the Good Docs project is another open source project, not backed by Google, but there are several Googlers involved, including me. This is the Doctopus, which is the mascot of the Good Docs project. And if you go to the project and raise an issue in the templates repo asking for a flavor of template you'd like to see, I personally will send you some Doctopus stickers, COVID or no COVID, remote conference, no remote conference. I love handing out stickers. Just add me to the issue and I'll follow up with you and get you your Doctopus stickers. Another repo for docs templates and supporting materials is the Open Docs repo on GitHub. That repo is for documentation help that's been open sourced by Google. It launched earlier this year with a very helpful docs audit checklist. If you already have some documentation, but you're not sure if it's the right documentation, working through an audit is a great way to make sure that you're putting your docs resources towards the highest value projects. Now, in terms of documentation help, the Write the Docs community is the place you should be. Their Slack community in particular is incredibly helpful and active. There's a hashtag open source channel, plus plenty of freelancers around and a very active job board. Surprising absolutely no one, professional technical writers really like to be helpful and explain things. So if you're not sure where to start at Write the Docs and ask. They have a couple of conferences a year that you can absolutely and should absolutely sponsor, and it's just an all-around great community. Now, the Google Open Source so the Google Open Source Programs Office also runs an external documentation program, Season of Docs. Although we've just announced the participating orgs for 2021, this is a program to put on your Docs radar for two reasons. First, definitely think about applying next year for your open source projects. The program awards grants to organizations to hire experienced technical writers to work on documentation projects. Also, this year the program has changed to require all participating orgs to submit a case study about their Docs projects. With a case study, we're looking to share information about the problems open source projects and orgs have that can be addressed by documentation and how effective these documentation projects are. Personally, I think we learn best from mistakes, but they don't have to be our own mistakes. We hope that these case studies will highlight best practices in documentation and help open source maintainers create effective docs for their own projects. So I've got some links for you. Here's a link, doxy.dev is where you can find the Doxy template. The gooddocsproject.dev is where you can find the Good Docs project templates. We're at OpenDocs in the Google org on GitHub, writethedocs.org, and developer.google.com, Season of Docs. So thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about Docs today with me. And I am happy, excuse me, I am happy to answer any questions. I'm pretty easy to find online. Just for your information, I'm not the Erin McKean online, who's a neurosurgeon, in case you were wondering. And I'm always happy to get docs-related questions. Just find me and ask me, and I'll also be answering some questions now live. So thanks again.